Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Elena, and I'm the Global Climate Justice Advocacy and Communication Lead at CARE's Climate Justice Center, which is the CARE's Climate Justice Hub, coordinating and enabling the integration of climate justice and resilience across CARE's development and humanitarian work. In the next half hours, I illustrate to you some of CARE's key experience and approaches within the context of the United Nations framework on Climate Change Convention, better known as UNFCCC. We look at what the UNFCCC is, why it was established, and how it operates. Who are the advocates, particularly through the prism of CARE international experience? What are the tactics and tools that are used in this context with communication strategies and specific messages, and a look at lessons learned, particularly using the experience in this context. So, what is the UNFCCC? The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the parent treaty of the Paris Agreement signed in 2015 and is the primary international treaty established in 1992, entering in force in 1994, to address the global challenge of climate change, effectively providing the foundation for global cooperation. The UNFCCC provides thematic linkages among institutions such as loss and damage, emergencies, adaptation for resilience building. It mobilizes finance for climate action based on legal obligation for developed countries, and it advances gender integration through gender action plan. This and much more. The UNFCCC hosts major climate conferences such as COP, the Conference of Parties, and the subsidiary bodies. In June, Bonn, Germany, host the subsidiary bodies meetings, which are somehow mid-year climate negotiations. It is a forum for technical discussions that help to lay the groundwork for major end-of-the-year UN climate change conferences. The Conference of Parties are the Conference of Parties is the climate conference happening every year. It is a forum where governments, the so-called parties, negotiate and advance climate commitments, such as the landmark Paris Agreement, which I just mentioned. It also receives technical bodies and mechanisms such as finance, transparency, capacity building, loss and damage, gender, and many more. So let's look at the thematic perspective. The thematic linkages I mentioned that are relevant are loss and damage and emergencies, adaptation for resilience building, mitigation to constrain climate change disaster. This is particularly important because the Paris Agreement aims to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius from above pre-industrial times, with efforts to cap the temperature increase at 1.5 degrees Celsius to reduce risk and impact for climate change. According to Climate Action Tracker, 1.8 degrees Celsius is the most optimistic projected level of warming by 2100 if the long-term carbon neutrality commitments are met. Then we have agriculture and food and nutrition system, inevitably because of the impact that climate change has on these systems. Guidance for national action. Now, the many decisions that have emerged in the UNFCCC filter back into the national level. So, for example, when it comes to incentivizing and supporting vulnerable developing countries in preparing national adaptation plans. So the UNFCCC has a role to negotiate based on expertise and technical inputs, and develop guidelines for these actions. So what is decided within the UNFCCC in various forms has an impact on what's happening nationally. Mobilizing finance, very important. That was at the very core of COP29 that was held last November in Baku, Azerbaijan, because finance for climate action based on legal obligation for developed countries is at the very core of any climate actions, and advancing gender integration through action plans. These themes connect closely with CARE's work. As you see from the infographic, we have this CARE operates under these general umbrellas of social justice, gender equality, and resistance. Climate change is cross-cutting. It's not a single issue, but it affects many sectors and areas of life simultaneously, intersecting with health, agriculture, food security, economy, migration, security, gender, education, you name it. Some of these themes are at the core of CARE's work as a humanitarian development organization. Adaptation is central, as it is loss and damage, by which refers to the impact that climate change that cannot be avoided or reversed through mitigation or adaptation, thus resulting in permanent harm and irreversible losses for communities, economies, and ecosystems. CARE's work also touches upon DRRs, disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, for food and nutrition security. Now, we advocate for scaling up public finance in climate actions to support developing countries with stronger components on gender equality, as well as systematically engaging women and girls through the climate adaptation design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation process. The 1.5 degrees Celsius that is at the top of this infographic is key because keeping it alive, as has become a very important and well-used slogan, remains at the core of the climate action, and it has been very intense in negotiations in terms of mitigation. Mitigation through, for example, shifting away from fossil fuels, through protecting forests, through technology transfer. CARE is working on renewable energies, particularly in vulnerable communities. We have projects where, for example, support female entrepreneurs in connecting their businesses to solar power mini grids. It can be like a small shop in West Africa. So in order to improve livelihoods, particularly of women and girls. Obviously, if we do not manage to limit global warming within this 1.5 degrees, as per the Paris Agreement, this will overwhelmingly affect communities and countries in which we work with. So this is where it has become important for our advocacy work as well. As said earlier, gender negotiations have been increasingly brought towards the center of the discussion and reached a critical point, for example, in 2019 with COP25 in Madrid with agreement on improved gender action plan. The overarching goal, gender equality, gender justice is at the core of climate justice, and it's been part of campaigns we've been focusing on, such as She Leads in Crisis, which really puts women and girls in broader gender justice at the center of global response to the climate crisis. So why do we engage? Why advocacy in WFCCC spaces? Engaging in these spaces is vital. COP is a really unique platform for non-state actors to influence policies and build connections, allowing civil society to shape decision-making, hold governments accountable, and push for stronger right-based climate action. It's a space where NGOs can contribute expertise, shape narratives, and ensure that justice, gender equity, and the protection of vulnerable populations stay at the very heart of global climate finance. So there are various ways in which we engage. CARE, which is marking 80 years since its establishment in 1945, has been engaging with the UNFCCC for nearly 2 decades. We're also been a pioneer in climate action with our first project, specifically looking at climate resilience in 2002 in Bangladesh. And since then, the work has increased, reaching in 2023 62 countries and nearly 5 million people. So we attend COP as well as the subsidiary bodies meetings like Bonn, and also contribute to other spaces within the UNFCCC. Different care member partners and country offices members uh, participate in these meetings, covering different issues and topics, looking at the national context as much as possible under one umbrella. Sometimes we go there because there is funding from a specific project, and we present experience from that project. So we engage with media, high-level policy and technical advocacy, program experience and knowledge sharing. In the third picture, we have a colleague of ours who specifically presented a loss and damage response project led by CARE Germany and implemented in Bangladesh, Kenya, Malawi, for example. So knowledge sharing through side events and specific panel. There are hundreds and hundreds at these events that are held in parallel to negotiations is critically important. CJC has a coordinator role. So we provide support, leadership to the CMPs and CEOs related to how establishing connection with media on site, supporting them in launching specific reports, and so also when COP, we also receive a lot of support from our country office in case, for example, COP is held in a particular country where CARE has a representation, which was the case, for example, in 2014 in Peru or in 2021 in the United Kingdom. In this case, obviously, there is an increased interest from the country office to play a more active role and also providing opportunities, for example, to connect with local and national media. So the COP is a very complex universe, as you can see from these infographics, which is not meant to scare anyone, but to illustrate how the negotiations are organized. So the conference is as effectively the convening of all countries. Each one holds one vote. So different countries form party groups or blocks with the aim of strengthening their negotiating power and promoting shared interest. And NGOs like CARE work with different groups and blocks. So we don't target the same country or the same block in the same way, but it really depends on the focus and priorities. Some of the key blocks are, for example, the G77 in China, which is actually far bigger than 77 because it comprises 130 developing countries plus China. The African Group of Negotiators focuses mainly on climate, finance, adaptation, and vulnerable communities. The Alliance for Small Island States is very important because it's a strong bloc pushing for strong action on 1.5 degrees Celsius, loss and damage amid sea level rising. So for them, it's an real existential threat. Least developed countries brings together 46 poorest nations to prioritize in adaptation, finance, loss and damage. Within the developed countries, the European Union and Canada, for example, for NGOs are seen as strategic allies for progressive action on gender outcomes. And then there are more challenging counterparts, as are increasing in Russia and the United States, which the Washington declared the intention to leave the Paris Agreement, for example. There are countries like Saudi Arabia or the Vatican, which pose quite strong, they quite oppose. They have very strong positions when it comes to gender negotiations. So it's a complex universe that has to be navigated in the process of the negotiation. Under the UN Climate Change Convention, developed countries have an obligation to provide financial support, particularly towards the vulnerable developing countries in terms of adaptation. So in these slides, we want to illustrate what the adaptation landscape under the UNFCCC has developed since the establishment of the UNFCCC in 92, entering into force in 1994. This system is complex, but there are obligations, and the fact that these obligations have been agreed upon is important because they're there, and they over time they have been able to mobilize finance, channeling finance through international fund, and all this is important because it basically provides material support for developing countries. When the UNFCCC was established, we had a very different level of knowledge and understanding of how climate change might unfold. So impacts and adaptation were still seen as something for the future to take care of. But over time, particularly starting with COP7 in 2001, it started playing a very important role. It moved more quickly to setting up institutions and instruments which could help with planning and piloting implementation. For example, the establishment of the National Adaptation Program of Actions, NAPAs, in 2001 at COP7, which enables developing countries to set their most urgent needs to adapt to climate change and National Habitation Program of Actions. The establishment of the Least Developed Countries Group as a particularly vulnerable group. Another milestone in 2005 with COP11 was the Nairobi Work Program that initiated, that was a key program to share knowledge and lessons learned on practical adaptation action. The Bali Action Plan in 2007 as well was relevant to scale up implementation. And then we move forward on 2010 with the Cancun Adaptation Framework and the establishment of the Green Climate Fund for that enable further building of coordinated and coherent action. The creation of the Warsaw International Mechanism in 2013 that for the related to loss and damage, in basically enhanced product knowledge and improved engagement. In 2019, we're looking at gender, COP25, the Enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender and its Gender Action Plan. So it's been a path, and in that that illustrates that there has been an evolution of the system, as well as in parallel and reflecting in a way countries' awareness of and their ability to intend and act. So going back to gender, this is a key element that has been one of the core, is at the core of also CARE's work. That's because women and girls, this is an understanding that women and girls bear the brunt of the climate crisis, but they're also often in the lead for identifying and implementing solutions, particularly in adaptation. That could be, for example, pioneering the rediscover of traditional crops, which prove to be climate resilience, or leading in the establishment of early warning committees. So there is this understanding, there is this knowledge. What is we need to move towards is actually to include women into the decision-making process, which is still not happening, particularly when we move to national and international fora. So what does it take? So when it comes to tactics and tools in advocacy, what does it take to successfully advocate for climate justice in this context? It is complex and multi-layered. Advocacy within the UNFCCC demands strategic coordination, persistence, and inclusive representation. And advocates work across formal and informal channels to influence policy. And success requires a blending technical expertise with powerful storytelling through the use of media, sustained pressure that is not just related to one specific conference or forum, and strong alliances. It's very important to team up with peers in our space. This is to ensure equity, rights, and lived experiences that are central to climate action. This type of advocacy can be direct or indirect, employing various tools with public actions and visuals, side events that are very important because they also help organizations such as Care International not only to raise their profile, storytelling, and strategic media engagement. The pictures on this slide illustrate some of our work. Through with media side events, participating to mobile to actions both on site as well as outside. So direct advocacy means effectively personal relations. These personal relations must be built and sustained through mutual trust. It is critical to engage with the institutions, around the institutions, and with the people within the institution themselves to maintain connection between the conferences. Just remember, do not wake up a month before COP or a month before Bonn or just around the time in which a report by the UNFCCC is issued. It's important to maintain and sustain this relationship. There are one element in terms of collaboration with negotiators is working with government delegations, obtaining the so-called pink badge, and it has pros and cons because obviously what it gives you more access, but it also limits in certain ways your room of influence. One aspect that is quite important is that developing countries specifically often look at organizations like CARE, not only for technical assistance. These organizations, specifically that as country offices, engage with their own government, but also engage as part of CARE or the CARE delegation. So it's a good balance between the two. You can engage with ministers, for example, although the ministers tend to come towards the end of the conference. So these are the elements where the direct work sustain the advocacy activity. And then there are the indirect advocacy work, and this is broader and it can be very creative as well. Media have play a really key role. So press releases reaching both general and specialized journalists. They could be international press releases that issued at the central level. For example, in the case of the CJC, we put together a press release and then national offices cascade them in their own context. And eventually they can also adapt them with quotes from their own country offices or references to projects they are implementing. Press conferences, they can be individual or you can meet the panel of other groups. Press conferences, most importantly for us, are the ones held by the Climate Action Network, CAN International as well as CAN Europe as national nodes for Europe or other nodes at the regional level. Then you have written submissions, NGO signing newsletters. So we regularly, through our alliances specifically, we receive NGO letters pushing for specific actions, most notably, for example, end fossil fuel or limiting the participation of fossil fuel lobbyists at these conferences. At COP29, 1,773 fossil fuel lobbyists were present, outnumbering many country delegations. So that's the type of elements we can also push for. The lobby letters are sent to ministers in advance of COPs, in preparation meetings or head of states. CMPs and country offices some of them do a lot of media work at the national level. So some offices are particularly active. I'm thinking about Cap Denmark or Cap France, Cap Germany, where they really push the agenda via the media. That works in certain contexts. It works less in others. It really depends on the country. And then you have actions at UNFCCC venues with partners such as CAN, Human Rights, or Women and Gender Constituency, and mobilization for marches at international level or a more localized areas. Media are really important. And we talk about communication for advocacy purposes. So media engagement and digital communication are very powerful advocacy tools for advancing climate justice in large conferences. These engagements amplifies marginalized voices, shape public narratives, and increase pressure on decision makers. As I said, it works more in central countries than others, but it remains a very powerful tool. How can this be done? Through social media, for example. Live coverage to share real-time updates for negotiations, as well as social media, social media, and where you can post updates from side events. For example, live tweeting. So you amplify the fact that CARE International, in our case, is leading on a side event, a COP29 on climate finance with some partners, and then you live tweet the updates from that. That ensures it also with specific hashtags, so you create traction around your event, even for those who are not attending. And these make complex processes accessible to global audiences. When it comes to social media, each platform has its own specific. So you need to be aware that's something that works for LinkedIn, which has grown enormously, doesn't necessarily work for X Twitter, partly because of the word count, but also the audience. What works if you want to post something on Instagram, you tend to develop strong visuals because that's what the platform takes on. So it really depends on what audience you are targeting. With at COP29, because of what is perceived to be an increasing toxic narratives on ex Twitter, there was a migration towards Blue Sky, which is very similar in terms of structure, but it has a different audience. So you also just do be mindful of that. Press briefings allow advocates to influence mainstream media coverage, framing climate justice as a core issue in policy discussion. This picture illustrates our colleague Obed Coringo, who is in the middle of what we call a media huddle. So the press briefings, press conferences are more formal setting. A huddle can be organized in any point of a venue. You just inform your media contacts that the huddle is taking place at that time in that space. And they will be there because usually these are organized to respond to immediate or last minute decisions. In this specific case, this was held the last day of the negotiations at COP29, where an agreement seemed to be was increasingly less clear whether it was going to be agreed upon or not. So there was a media huddle to get immediate comments from civil society. The strategic use of hashtag and digital campaigns can mobilize online support and elevate specific demands. CARE in 2023 had two specific campaigns. One was Climate Change is Sexy, that specifically stressed how women and girls are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change in various settings. GenAdapt looked at how the new generation had to adapt to the impact of climate change, and we developed campaigns with obviously the hashtag, but visuals, videos, photo, and testimonies that we then shared across all our digital channels as well as media. Storytelling through short-term videos and reels is also very relevant because it humanizes the climate change and drive emotional engagement. So we filmed testimonies of people who are at the front line of climate change. In this specific case, we're looking at our partner from Nigeria and the work her organization has been doing to advance the role of women and engagement in these spaces. The building key messages, delivering strong messages is crucial to all advocacy efforts. A few points. Design a call to action, a compelling and clear message that delivers your policy demands. For example, pay up for loss and damage, stressing the climate financing as aspect in the commitment from developed countries. Develop 3-4 key messages that must deliver throughout all engagement activities. 3-4 messages that are repeated in all the engagement, whether they are public mobilization, action at the venue, press huddles or conferences, as well as direct media engagement. It's important to elaborate proof points for your key messages. So science-based evidence and proof points because they create consistency and credibility. Unfortunately, climate change is exposed more and more to deniers. So your points, your data must be bulletproof. They have to be, you need to provide strong evidence for them. And it is very important. Once you have all of that, you make sure that, first of all, you identify spokespersons within your organizations, and they are fully aware of what these messages are, so that they are in a position to disseminate them in all their engagement, whether they are meeting negotiators, media, and peer organizations. Slogan and messages. I'm presenting here a few examples of messages that have been used in the last COP. So just as an example of what they are and who are the organization behind them. Keep 1.5 alive has been a constant and is part of the mitigation stream. Loss and damage now, as well as pay up for loss and damage. Messaging around loss and damage has been consistent throughout the years because that has been a long-term campaign that finally led to a breakthrough at COP29 with the establishment of the fund. Finance climate action now, Can International and Debt for Climate have been really open to that. Pushing for climate finance with messages like pay up, finance climate justice now have been at the core of the last COP. As Care International, we push for the message of the cost of climate inaction exceeds the cost of climate action. Then you have for example, the Women Agenda Constituency pushing that feminists hold the line as part of their messaging. So what are the lessons learned? Climate conferences and processes serve various purposes: advocacy, media profiling, knowledge sharing of organizations' work and activities, and networking. So it's also totally okay if people come attend these conferences for focusing on networking and sharing programmatic experience, and they don't necessarily see themselves as advocates, although the moment you do that, automatically you are doing advocacy work. So it is key to focus on your purpose and identity, and identify what you want to get from this event. So a few points that we learned from our experience is that relevance of negotiation vary. So the negotiations focus on, while touching upon all issues that I mentioned, they tend to focus on one specific theme. Like, for example, COP29 was known as the final COP because that was at the very core of the negotiation related to updating the new finance goal. big agreements, technical work, national implementation and reporting. A key element is that continuous engagement is critical. Do not see the UNFCCC as a one-year campaign stain. It's important to sustain long-term engagement because it is fruitful and it bears results, particularly on an individual level. So you can maintain these relations throughout time and see results throughout different conferences over the years. Building relationships with government officials takes time, but this connection lasts for a long time as well. So there is a long term aspect to be considered in terms of results. And identify your specific area of expertise, but maintain and be mindful that it's important to keep abreast of all developments. I think that remembering that a longer term commitment and engagement vary, but is relevant, has to be sustained. Think about the fact that the UNFCCC doesn't work as a one-year campaign. Ideally, you are able to know and engage in longer term, not just one more COP. And so the more you're engaged, the better the process of building relations is. So there is also a discussion, for example, about whether conferences like COP should be held every 2 years with just technical negotiations in between, while some critics say they shouldn't be held all together, so they're not relevant anymore. So I think it's very important to understand the process and build relationship to influence this process. I obviously, I hope that I was able to provide you with some fruitful example from our experience about how advocacy in this space works, highlighted some of the approaches. I hope that this complements some of the other work you've been doing in this learning journey. And thank you very much.